There are moments in life when the loudest sound is the one that never comes. Not a scream, not a goodbye, not even the brittle echo of explanation. Only absence. It arrives like fog, soft, formless, impossible to grasp. One day, someone is there, laughing, promising, existing, and the next, they are not. No warning, no confrontation, just the hollow space where a voice used to be. And that silence, more than any argument or farewell, becomes the question you can't stop asking. Why do some people vanish instead of closing the door behind them? Why do they retreat into silence when words could bring understanding, or at least an ending? The answer, as it turns out, lies deep within the architecture of the human mind. In fear, in avoidance, in the delicate balance between self-protection and connection. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is communication of a different kind, one shaped by trauma, anxiety, and the fragile hope that not saying anything might hurt less than saying the wrong thing. But for those left behind, silence is not neutral. It's noise, deafening in its uncertainty, haunting in its ambiguity. This is the psychology of silence, the unspoken story of why some people walk away without closure, and how those left in the quiet must learn to build meaning from the void.
Silence in human relationships has never been just a lack of words. It is a form of expression, a language of avoidance, of fear, of power, and sometimes of peace. To understand why people walk away without closure, we must first understand silence as both an act and a message. When someone withdraws without explanation, the silence they leave behind does not remain empty. It fills quickly with meaning, the mind's attempt to interpret what the heart cannot bear to leave undefined.
In that space between presence and disappearance, silence becomes a kind of psychological canvas, and every unspoken word becomes a brushstroke of uncertainty. Humans are, by nature, meaning-seeking beings. We communicate not only to express, but to connect, to belong, and to understand. Words are the tools we use to bring the invisible, thoughts, fears, feelings, into shared reality. When words vanish, so does the bridge between two minds. Yet silence, ironically, is never truly empty. It speaks, sometimes louder than speech itself. A mother's quiet disapproval, a partner's withdrawn glance, the unanswered message that glows faintly on a phone screen, all communicate volumes. Silence is, in fact, one of the most emotionally charged forms of communication humans possess. It can soothe, it can punish, it can protect. And when someone walks away without closure, silence becomes the final sentence in a story that refuses to end. From a psychological standpoint, silence is rarely a void. It is an action disguised as inaction, a way the human mind regulates unbearable emotional tension. For those who find confrontation intolerable, who experience vulnerability not as a bridge, but as a threat, silence becomes both armor and anesthesia. It protects, conceals, and postpones pain. To understand this, we must look at silence not as a single behavior, but as the visible surface of deeper psychological processes. Beneath it often lies a complex mixture of anxiety, shame, avoidance, and learned helplessness, mechanisms that evolved not in the moment of departure, but across a lifetime of emotional conditioning. According to attachment theory, first articulated by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth, every individual develops an internal, working model of relationships during early childhood. This model, shaped by the consistency and sensitivity of primary caregivers, defines how one perceives intimacy, trust, and safety. When a child's emotional needs are met with warmth and responsiveness, the world feels predictable. Emotions become safe to express. But when care is inconsistent, dismissive, or punitive, the child learns a different lesson: that expressing need invites rejection, and that silence may be safer than reaching out. Those with avoidant attachment styles often grow up in environments where emotional independence was rewarded and vulnerability ignored. They learn to self-soothe through withdrawal, internalizing the belief that proximity equals danger. As adults, this translates into an instinctive urge to retreat when emotional intimacy deepens. Conflict, requests for communication, or even the expectation of emotional accountability can trigger the same physiological responses as threat: racing heart, tight chest, constricted throat. The nervous system reads emotional exposure as peril, so they protect themselves in the only way they know: through silence. The unspoken logic is simple. If I don't speak, I can't say the wrong thing. If I disappear, I can't be rejected. Psychologists describe avoidance as one of the most pervasive coping mechanisms for anxiety. It is the mind's way of seeking safety by reducing exposure to perceived emotional danger. In relationships, this can manifest in subtle ways: unanswered messages, delayed responses, vague reassurances, or the quiet fading that eventually hardens into disappearance. From the outside, avoidance looks like indifference, but internally, it is a storm, a cycle of ambivalence and guilt. The person who withdraws often oscillates between the fear of hurting someone else and the terror of being emotionally trapped. Silence, then, becomes a way to maintain control in a moment that feels uncontrollable. In cognitive behavioral terms, silence functions as negative reinforcement. The immediate relief from anxiety rewards the act of avoidance, making it more likely to occur again. Each time silence works, by reducing tension or averting confrontation, the pattern strengthens, even though the long-term consequences are corrosive. What feels like control is, in truth, captivity. For those who disappear, silence often feels merciful. It spares them the discomfort of explaining emotions they can't articulate, or the guilt of witnessing another person's pain. They tell themselves, consciously or not, that disappearing quietly is kinder than confessing uncertainty. But this is an illusion born of empathy fatigue and emotional immaturity. Silence doesn't protect, it merely redistributes pain. The person who vanishes avoids the anxiety of confrontation, but the emotional weight they evade is transferred onto the one left behind, who must now carry confusion, self-doubt, and the ache of unanswered questions. Moreover, silence often masks internal conflict rather than peace. Cognitive dissonance, the tension between believing oneself to be a kind person while knowing one's actions cause harm, festers quietly. Over time, that dissonance can manifest as guilt, insomnia, or a persistent sense of incompleteness. The psyche, in its drive toward coherence, never truly rests while empathy remains unresolved. There is paradoxically a logic to this kind of silence. For those who have experienced chaotic or unsafe relationships, emotional disengagement feels like self-preservation. Their nervous system has learned that distance equals safety. Thus, walking away without closure is not calculated cruelty, but conditioned reflex. When faced with a situation that demands vulnerability, a difficult conversation, an apology, a declaration of doubt, the avoidant brain activates its threat response. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, yields to the amygdala, which governs fear. The result is flight, the instinct to withdraw rather than confront. In this state, silence feels not only natural but necessary. It offers the illusion of control amid inner chaos, a momentary escape from the unbearable intimacy of being known too deeply or judged too harshly. Yet this control is fragile, sustained only by avoidance. What the avoidant person fails to see is that silence, while protecting them from immediate discomfort, condemns them to a deeper loneliness. The same defense that shields them from pain also isolates them from connection, the very thing their psyche quietly craves. Silence may defer conflict, but it cannot erase it. When emotions are repressed rather than expressed, they persist in the unconscious, seeking resolution through dreams, intrusive thoughts, or new relationships that replay old dynamics. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion, the tendency to unconsciously recreate unresolved situations in the hope of a different ending. Thus, those who vanish without closure often find themselves haunted by similar patterns: relationships that end abruptly, feelings of guilt they can't explain, and an ongoing discomfort with intimacy. Silence buys time, but the debt of avoidance always comes due. In the end, silence as a defense mechanism is both tragic and telling. It reveals a deep internal contradiction, the yearning for closeness entangled with the terror of it. To the one who leaves, silence feels like safety. To the one left behind, it feels like abandonment. But at its core, both are suffering the same thing, the inability to face pain head-on. Silence, then, is not the absence of communication. It is communication shaped by fear. And though it may spare words, it speaks volumes about the fragile architecture of the human heart. Human beings make emotional decisions the same way they make financial ones, by unconsciously evaluating costs and rewards. When someone chooses silence over confrontation, it's rarely because they don't care. It's because, in that moment, communication feels too expensive. The psychological cost of honesty, vulnerability, and potential rejection outweighs the relief that truth might bring. And so, silence becomes emotional currency. The cheapest way to exit a situation that feels too heavy to carry. This emotional economy isn't logical, but it's deeply human. It's rooted in the brain's constant balancing act between the desire for connection and the instinct for self-preservation. In behavioral psychology, every choice is influenced by reinforcement, the brain's way of linking actions to outcomes. Silence, in this framework, functions as a form of negative reinforcement, the removal of discomfort. When someone avoids an emotionally charged conversation, they feel an immediate sense of relief. Their anxiety subsides, their heart rate slows, and their thoughts quiet, if only temporarily. That relief teaches the brain a powerful lesson. Avoidance works. The next time emotional discomfort arises, silence becomes the go-to strategy. It's a reflex conditioned not by malice, but by the reward of peace. However, this kind of peace is deceptive. What begins as a coping mechanism gradually transforms into a behavioral loop, a self-reinforcing cycle where each act of silence strengthens the fear of confrontation. The emotional ledger becomes unbalanced, relief in the short term, but compounding guilt, disconnection, and regret in the long term. While silence provides momentary relief, it accrues what can be called emotional debt. The feelings one avoids do not disappear. They accumulate interest in the subconscious. Unresolved guilt transforms into restlessness. Suppressed emotions manifest as irritability, insomnia, or the dull ache of emotional numbness. The human psyche, much like a financial system, seeks balance. When emotions are withheld or repressed, they resurface elsewhere. In other relationships, in self-doubt, or in the quiet sense that something essential remains unfinished. For the person who walks away, this emotional debt is subtle but enduring. They may tell themselves they made the right choice, that silence was mercy, or that the other person didn't need an explanation. But deep down, the mind knows what the heart avoids. It knows that something has been left unresolved, and that unresolved emotions always find their way back to consciousness. Thus, silence does not eliminate pain. It only delays its payment. Neuroscience offers a compelling explanation for why silence feels deceptively efficient. When the brain perceives potential emotional danger, like conflict, rejection, or shame, it activates the amygdala, the center responsible for fear responses. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, which governs reason and empathy, temporarily shuts down to conserve energy. In this state, the individual is not thinking rationally. They are protecting. Silence, then, is not a conscious decision to harm. It's a neurobiological shortcut to safety. It's the brain's way of saying, let's not go there. But this shortcut bypasses the very process that allows emotional growth, communication, empathy, and accountability. The brain chooses efficiency over healing, mistaking silence for safety in the same way a wounded animal retreats to the dark. Unfortunately, what feels like survival in the moment often becomes isolation over time. Silence also fulfills a subtler need, the desire to retain control. In emotionally charged situations, words make people vulnerable. To explain oneself is to open the door to misunderstanding, judgment, or loss of power. By staying silent, one retains authorship of their own narrative, even if it means abandoning someone else's. This is particularly true for individuals who associate vulnerability with danger. To them, silence is not just avoidance, it's strategy. It allows them to manage perception, to vanish gracefully rather than risk being seen as cruel, confused, or weak. The logic is self-soothing. If I say nothing, I cannot be blamed for what I didn't say. Yet, paradoxically, silence communicates guilt more loudly than words ever could. The absence of explanation becomes its own statement, one that the other person must interpret, usually in the most painful possible way. Control, it turns out, is an illusion. Because the moment someone walks away without closure, they surrender control over how their silence will be understood. The longer silence persists, the heavier it becomes. What might have been a momentary pause turns into a wall, and the unsaid words begin to inflate in emotional significance. For the one who left, this inflation can lead to avoidance paralysis. The longer they stay silent, the harder it becomes to speak. They begin to fear not only the confrontation, but also the shame of having remained silent for so long. For the one left behind, the same inflation works in reverse. Every unanswered message becomes a symbol. Every quiet day, an accusation. The silence stops being about a single person and begins to represent something larger: rejection, inadequacy, or abandonment itself. This is the cruel symmetry of silence. Both sides suffer from the same absence, but in different languages. There is, whether acknowledged or not, a moral dimension to silence. To withhold communication is to withhold another person's access to understanding, to deny them the dignity of closure. This doesn't mean that every ending must be explained in detail, or that every truth must be spoken aloud. But to disappear entirely is to rob another person of their narrative coherence, and in doing so, to inflict an injury of confusion. The person who leaves often rationalizes this as kindness, better silence than cruelty. But in reality, silence is rarely gentle. It forces the other to do the emotional labor of decoding, interpreting, and healing alone. In moral psychology, this can be seen as an omission of empathy, not the deliberate infliction of pain, but the failure to take responsibility for it. And yet, most people who disappear are not malicious. They are simply unequipped. They have never learned that silence can wound as deeply as words. Over time, habitual silence reshapes identity. What begins as a coping mechanism becomes a defining feature of selfhood. The person who consistently avoids emotional dialogue may start to see themselves as the one who doesn't get attached, the one who doesn't need closure, or the one who moves on easily. But these are not truths, they are defenses. Behind such identities often lies a deep hunger for understanding, paired with a fear that understanding will expose too much. Silence, then, becomes not only a behavior, but a belief system, a worldview where distance equals safety and detachment equals strength. The tragedy of this mindset is that it creates the very loneliness it tries to avoid. The person who flees emotional discomfort ends up constructing a life that feels calm on the surface but hollow beneath. The emotional economy of disappearance always reaches its reckoning. Even if the one who leaves never returns, the silence follows them, echoing through new relationships, resurfacing in moments of guilt or nostalgia. The absence of closure becomes a haunting pattern, a recurring chapter that never truly ends. In truth, silence is never free. It demands payment from both sides, from the one who uses it as a shield and from the one who must live in its shadow. Those who disappear pay with loneliness, those left behind pay with doubt, and both in their own ways learn the same painful truth: that silence may feel like safety, but it is never peace. Psychologically, one of the hardest things for the human brain to tolerate is uncertainty. When someone disappears without closure, the person left behind experiences what psychologists call ambiguous loss, a state where the relationship is neither alive nor dead, resolved nor broken. Unlike death, where mourning has a defined trajectory, ambiguous loss traps people in emotional limbo. There is no ritual for closure, no clear ending to process. You can't grieve someone who still exists, and you can't move on when part of you is still waiting for them to return. This form of silence creates cognitive dissonance. The heart believes one thing, they cared, while reality suggests another, they're gone. In trying to reconcile the two, the mind spins endlessly, searching for logic where there is only emotion. For those who choose silence, walking away without closure often feels like reclaiming autonomy. To speak, to explain, would mean relinquishing control over how the other person perceives them. By saying nothing, they preserve an illusion that they can exit without consequence, that silence is a clean break rather than a wound. But this illusion is fragile. Silence, in the long run, does not erase responsibility. It amplifies it, because every unanswered question becomes a monument to avoidance, every ghosted message a reminder of the words they were too afraid to say. To walk away without closure is, in essence, to choose comfort over conscience. And yet, paradoxically, many who do so are not cruel, only scared. Our society often fails to teach emotional literacy, the ability to name, understand, and communicate our internal states. When emotions are perceived as weakness, silence becomes strength. When vulnerability is punished, retreat becomes survival. Thus, many adults navigate relationships like emotional exiles, fluent in intellect but illiterate in feeling. They know how to plan, achieve, and perform, but not how to say, "I'm hurt, I'm confused," or "I don't know how to end this kindly." Silence, then, becomes their only language of honesty, because it's the only one they were ever allowed to speak. Not all silence is malicious. Sometimes it is the only way a person knows how to survive. There are people who withdraw not to punish, but to protect themselves or others from further harm. But protection born of fear still leaves collateral damage. Silence might save one person from immediate discomfort, but it burdens another with lasting doubt. And while it is easy to judge those who disappear, compassion requires recognizing the wounded logic behind their behavior. Silence is not always cruelty. Sometimes it's unhealed pain in disguise. When we encounter silence, we are forced to confront not only the absence of another, but the presence of ourselves. In the quiet left behind, we begin to hear the echoes of our own insecurities, our own fears of not being enough. The psychology of silence, therefore, is not just about those who leave. It's also about those who stay. It's about what silence reveals, the deep human need to be seen, understood, and acknowledged. And when that acknowledgement never comes, we learn that closure, like healing, is an inside job. Silence is not the absence of truth. It is its most complicated form, a language shaped by fear, by memory, and by the delicate art of self-preservation. Those who walk away without closure do not always do so from cruelty. Often they do it from a place of deep emotional fragility. They vanish not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much, and do not yet have the tools to bear it aloud. Throughout this exploration, we have seen how silence functions as defense, as control, as habit, and as consequence. It is a psychological echo that originates in early attachment wounds and reverberates throughout adult relationships. What begins as protection soon becomes isolation. What feels like control eventually turns into disconnection. The quiet exit spares confrontation but multiplies confusion, leaving both sides imprisoned by what remains unsaid. Yet to condemn silence outright would be too simple. In some ways, silence reveals the most human truth of all, our fear of being seen completely. To speak honestly is to risk rejection. To stay silent is to risk regret. Every human heart, at one point or another, has stood at that crossroads, torn between the courage to communicate and the safety of retreat. The tragedy is not in choosing silence, but in never learning what it was trying to say. For those left behind, healing does not come from waiting for an explanation that may never arrive. It begins when we stop seeking closure as something to be received and start creating it as something to be built. Psychologically, this shift represents a transition from external locus of control, where peace depends on others, to internal locus of control, where peace depends on one's own capacity to make meaning. Closure, then, is not a conversation. It is a realization that understanding is less important than acceptance, and that the absence of answers does not mean the absence of value. The mind may crave logic, but the heart requires surrender. True closure is found not in someone else's words, but in the quiet recognition that silence itself was an answer. Perhaps not the one we wanted, but the one that teaches the most. When we finally stop chasing the echo of what was never said, silence begins to change shape. It ceases to be punishment and becomes perspective, a mirror reflecting not loss, but growth. In this reflection, we find that the pain of being left without closure was not simply abandonment, but initiation, a forced confrontation with our own resilience, our own voice, our own capacity to heal. The paradox of silence is that it teaches us to listen. In the absence of another's explanation, we learn to hear the subtler language of our own intuition. We learn to distinguish between what was taken from us and what was always ours to reclaim: dignity, clarity, self-trust. The person who once sought closure now becomes the person who offers it, to themselves, to others, to the world. That transformation is the quiet victory hidden in every unanswered goodbye. Silence, in the end, is universal. Across cultures, relationships, and generations, people walk away, disappear, stop explaining. Not because they wish to wound, but because they do not know how to stay. The story of silence is not one of villains and victims, but of humans doing their best within the limits of their emotional vocabulary. To understand this is not to excuse the pain it causes, but to transcend it. Compassion is not agreement, it is comprehension. And in understanding why some people cannot give closure, we learn how to give it to ourselves, and how, in turn, to leave others more gently than we were left. There will always be silences that haunt us: the friend who never called back, the lover who disappeared mid-sentence, the parent who couldn't say, "I'm sorry." But as time passes, those silences begin to soften. They lose their sharpness and become something else, not absence, but atmosphere. They remind us that not every story requires an epilogue, not every ending needs a reply. In the quiet that remains, we discover something sacred, not the closure we once demanded, but the wisdom that silence was never emptiness at all. It was space. Space for us to grow, to rebuild, to listen to the faint but enduring sound of our own healing. Because sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we never receive, and the truest closure is learning to live beautifully without them.